welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 72. And my guest in this episode is Dr. Matthew David Segall. He is a returning guest, but I will say that he is the assistant professor in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco. And this will be his third time on my show. And I encourage you to go back down through the catalog and find his other conversations. I really enjoy having him as a guest, and in this episode we're going to be discussing his new book called Crossing the Threshold, Etheric Imagination and the Post-Kantian Process Philosophy of Schelling and Whitehead. And yes, that's a lot of terrain to cover, and we'd cover a fair amount of that in this conversation, and I'm always happy to have him on as a guest, and I hope you enjoy our dialogue. Thank you so much for being here. And I'd like to re-welcome Dr. Matthew David Segall to the IdeaCast interview series. We are going to be talking about his new book, and I'm looking forward to that. And if you follow my channel, if you've been subscribed for more than a few months, you know that Matt's been on a couple of times. Really grateful to have his company every time. One of my, don't tell anybody else, but he's probably one of my favorite guests to get on board. Matt, welcome. Glad to have you here.
Thanks, Justin. Pleasure to be back.
Yes, yes. And I say favorite, not in a sort of hierarchical sense, but just your company and your presence I very much enjoy. So as I do all my guests, but I just glad to have you here. So
appreciate it.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk about your new book. First of all, congratulations. I'm glad that we have a new book from you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, I'll say Crossing the Threshold, and I'll have to check my notes to get the rest of it right, but it's Etheric Imagination in the Post-Kantian Philosophy of Schelling and Whitehead. Did I get that right?
Process philosophy, one word in there that was...
Oh, okay.
The process philosophy, post-Kantian process.
See, I'm glad I checked in. Thank you for
It's a long title.
I do my shorthand too, and it's sometimes...
Yeah. It's like one of these medieval philosophy texts that has a paragraph-long title, so... hope people can manage it.
Well, I like Crossing the Threshold. I think that, that we'll start with that. And so this conversation, you and I will be in that liminal space of the threshold, and we're going to oscillate back and forth. So there's another subheading of the theme of this conversation. But no, I think it's appropriate because I think for people who are invested in your work and in process metaphysics, Whitehead's work, and German idealism altogether, you have to kind of make that happen. So. And people who engage in this kind of work are not intellectually lazy, I don't think. So it's good that it's there. So before we get into that discussion, I want to just share a couple thoughts. I love how you play with the theme and the idea and the symbolism of plants, especially towards the end. You open me up to some new people who've worked with plants and philosophy, and I need to explore that. I'm an amateur horticulturalist and hobbyist in the sense of just a passion for botany and horticulture, and recently came across Paco Clavo's book. He was on James Cook's podcast the other day, and talking about sort of proto-sentience, proto-cognition or quasi-cognition in plants. And so how you play with that in your book towards the end, I appreciated that. So the metaphor and the symbolism that came in. So that's one insight I wanted to share with you personally before we open up the book.
I'm good. Glad to hear you connect with that. It's both a metaphor, but also I think there's something quite literal about the sense in which we are plants. We're more than plants, but we are also plants. And it goes all the way back to Plato, that the human being, he suggests, is best imagined as an inverted plant, where our roots, the root ball is the brain, and it sort of, we don't see the roots, they're invisible, but they stretch up into the heavens. And while we do have legs and move around, and plants, unlike animals, are mostly in the same place, though depending on the time frame, now that we have time-lapse photography, we can really see, no, they move actually quite a bit. They breathe and they respond intelligently to changes in their environment and so on. But I think there are times when I am drawing that connection metaphorically, but other times when I mean quite literally that there is a vegetal dimension to our own consciousness.
And as you said, there's an animacy there, whereas we otherwise, and I think that that's a humbling thought, that we are by nature of being these ambulatory creatures, that we see things in a different time scale, and so plants move. Oak trees live hundreds of years, and the if you will, ambulation, or the moving of a vine seeking its next place to put a tendril on to, or a cirrus, as they say, those kind of planning moves, we just don't catch it, ordinarily. Heliotropism, right. That's, if you're really patient. In fact, there was a time, we have bamboo in my area that grows several inches a day, and I thought, well, what if I sat in a chair and I just dedicated 2 hours or 3 hours of my life in a very sort of Zen-like meditative practice, and just watch, and then maybe put, you could put a yardstick right next to it. I never did that, but I just thought, yeah, that's how you can come in contact with the animacy found in our companions in the other kingdom.
Takes a little patience. Yeah.
So anyway, I did very much appreciate that, because I have dedicated about 30 years of my life to being passionate about plants, mostly palm trees, because I live in Florida, and so yeah, and I kind of like Johnny Palm Seed. I spread palms everywhere if I can. So
that's great.
So let's talk. The other weird thing I noticed in your book is at least the copy that I got, the book epilogue finished on page 247, which was the birth month of Alfred North Whitehead and the death year of Alfred North Whitehead. So he was born in February 1861, I think, and then he passed in 1947. And so
that's right.
It's very bizarre. This is how random I am, but it just landed on those.
Yeah, that was not intentional.
Okay. And the other thing I thought that was interesting, because I'm a Googleaholic when it comes to looking things up, is that his son, was it Thomas North Whitehead? Was his son?
He had a son and a daughter. Eric was his son.
That passed during World War I?
Yeah. Did he have another son?
Well, according to the Googles, there was a Thomas North Whitehead. And the other weird bit of information is he was born in Cambridge, England, and died in Cambridge, Mass. I think 1891, and then died in 1969. According to Wikipedia, he was the son of Alfred North Whitehead. But I do know what you're saying. Eric passed in World War I, right? Because that's a big chapter in Alfred's life, if I recall. Now, I didn't know he had a daughter. That's interesting.
Yeah, Jessie, I believe, was her name.
Okay, I'll have to look into her.
Yeah. Don't know too much about his other children. Like I vaguely recalling that he had another son, but yeah, he was a family man and a scholar.
Absolutely. So Matt, let's get involved in this book of yours and have a nice going over an examination. And again, I'm like general audience, street level. I'm not educated at all, so you'll be my support here. You're going to be my wingman that takes care of me when I say certain things, and so I beg your patience in advance. What I saw, and I do appreciate in chapter 2, you really do a nice layout of Whitehead's scheme, and so it's a good refresher course in Whitehead. So to the YouTube audience, and I didn't welcome the YouTube audience earlier, I apologize. I would suggest that you become familiar with Whitehead's work if you're just coming here out of the blue. If people are familiar with Whitehead's work, this book is very accessible. But what I get out of the tension, or the reason there's a threshold there, is that I'm trying to think of a good place to start, is that we're dealing with Kant's transcendental idealism, and he sort of paints himself into a corner in certain regards with some of the propositions that he lays out in that transcendental idealism. And then you come along and you come up with a term, I don't know if this is your term exclusively, but it's a descendental reframing of things. And so if you want to start there, and we'll unpack Kant's, if you think this is a good place to start, Kant's answering, and this is the threshold, he's answering to Descartes, he's answering to Hume, he's answering to a few other people. So I thought if that's a good place to start, or if you want to steer this in another direction, please, by all means. Okay, if we could,
yeah. So descendental philosophy is partially something I've coined, but I'm also borrowing from a footnote in Schelling's late lectures on positive philosophy, where he makes reference to, in Latin, a philosophia descendens, as opposed to an ascending philosophy, where idealism typically would be construed as a philosophy that ascends to the ideal. And Schelling, of course, was quite practiced in idealistic philosophical methods himself, but nonetheless, at the end of his life, realized there was a need to bring this into balance with another approach, which he mostly referred to as positive philosophy, and he would see negative philosophy, with Hegel as the chief exemplar, as a kind of negative philosophy. And so the descendental method is in some ways an inversion of Kant. Mm-hmm. But why would we want to invert Kant? I like the way you describe Kant's transcendental idealism as, in a way, Kant painting himself into a corner. Because when Kant began to think about knowledge in this new way, he was, as you said, responding to David Hume, the empiricist, who made some very, what for Kant at the time were very startling criticisms of the possibility of scientific knowledge of nature. And what would constitute scientific knowledge would be the ability to devise necessary and universal laws, right, that we can understand mathematically. And Newton's, laws of motion are a great example of this. And Kant was very deeply schooled in the Newtonian approach to mathematical physics, and he read Hume, basically showing that we have no empirical basis for necessary connection or causality in nature, that this is something we merely infer, that's sort of a result of a habit of our thinking, that we associate two different events with one another. We experience them in conjunction often enough that we say, okay, this causes that. That might be good enough for practical purposes and making, common sense predictions about the world. But if you want to do science, you need more than just constant conjunction. You need necessary connection. In other words, something you can devise mathematical formula to predict with absolute precision. And so Kant realized that Hume was right about this. And so it led him to totally reformulate the relationship of the knower, the knowing mind, to the known, to the world of objects. So prior to Kant, the idea was that the human subject gains knowledge of the objective world in this sort of unproblematic way. Like, the objects are out there, we observe the objects, and then we think about them using our concepts. Now, the problem with this is that, as Hume laid out, as I just explained, we don't observe anything like causality in our perceptual experience. And so what Kant does is he inverts this relationship between subject and object. And Kant analogizes this to what Copernicus did in astronomy, by, instead of having the Earth at the center, with all the heavenly bodies, the planets and the stars moving around the Earth, Copernicus says, well, what if I put the Earth into motion? And so what Kant does is say, instead of the objects being given to the subject, which then comes to know them, what if we said that our subjective activity is at the center of everything, and that when we think we're knowing an object, what we're really doing is coming to know our own categories of understanding and our own intuitions of space and time. So rather than space and time being just out there that we then come to know subjectively, Kant says, no, space and time and our categories like causality that we use to understand the world, these are given a priori. They structure the very nature of possible experience. And so rather than having to, admit, as Hume argues, that we have no knowledge of causation in nature, Kant says we can only know nature in terms of causality, because nature or the world is always already filtered through our apparatus of knowing, right? Including all of our senses and all of our concepts. And so this is a kind of Copernican revolution in philosophy, right? Rather than the subject having to go outside itself to know objects, Kant says, no. The subject never goes outside itself to know objects. The subject is determining objects using its own activity, its own conceptual reflection, and its own forms of intuition, which is his phrase for what space and time are. And so Kant's transcendental method is a way of, he thought, reestablishing philosophy and metaphysics on a new ground, right? And he thought a more scientific ground. And he set about trying to reestablish natural science on this idealistic basis. And one of the things that he was concerned to avoid was this march of a kind of mechanistic science explaining not only gravitation, explaining the physical world in mechanistic terms, but he was worried that eventually this method would be applied to the biological world and then to human beings, and then we would be at risk of losing our sense of human freedom. Kant was a moral philosopher as much as he was a natural philosopher. And so for him to articulate this new transcendental method was not only to shore up the possibility of real scientific knowledge, or I should say ideal scientific knowledge, and I'll explain why that's an important nuance, but also to protect our moral freedom from reduction to a mechanism. So for Kant, our human freedom, including our freedom of thought, is something that science, natural science, presupposes. And so there could never be a scientific explanation of human freedom, right? For Kant, that's in another realm. And what we're left with, and this is the problematic situation that I'm trying to address in this book, we're left with not an ontological dualism anymore, which is what we had in, say, Descartes' philosophy. We had a mental substance and an extended or material substance. And the problem was, well, how do these two different substances relate? Kant doesn't leave us with an ontological dualism, but rather with an epistemological dualism. For Kant, what science knows when it comes up with laws of physics and so on is only the phenomenal realm, the realm of appearances, right? Nature as it appears to us in spatial and temporal terms. Beyond that realm of phenomena is what? A mere X, Kant says, like an algebraic symbol. It's a placeholder for the realm of things in themselves that all we can say about it is that it exists, this realm. We can't know anything else about it. This is the realm of noumena as opposed to phenomena. So this is the epistemological dualism. And the threshold that I'm trying to cross is precisely this threshold of knowledge. And it's not that Kant is simply wrong about this threshold or this boundary. I treat him as the guardian of the threshold. We need to be very careful in our attempts to move beyond this boundary, this threshold, because as Kant pointed out, the history of metaphysics is full of contradictory claims as to what exists beyond the boundary of our sensory organization and our categories of understanding. And, one of the most enduring and profound parts of Kant's critique of pure reason was what are called the antinomies of reason, where he shows, for example, that he can come up with a great argument for why space is infinite, and he can come up with a great argument for why it's finite. And reason alone can't decide. That's what an antinomy is. And so rather than just say, oh, Kant was wrong, we can just bound ahead and cross the threshold. No, I really wanted to go through the trial of the Kantian method, to introduce it, to show what problems it was trying to solve. But then, it leaves us in a situation wherein we can't know reality. And I think process philosophy, as articulated in Schelling's work in the late 18th and early 19th century, and later in the 20th century by Whitehead, provides us with a means of crossing this threshold, but it does require reimagining philosophy as not just about conceptual determination of appearances, but also philosophy can know in an aesthetic way, that we can reimagine knowledge as in some way a function of feeling. And Whitehead is a philosopher of feeling, and knowledge for Whitehead is a form of feeling. It's the result of a very complex contrast among feelings. Some of those feelings are physical and others are conceptual, but nonetheless, it's feelings all the way down and all the way up, right? And so when we reimagine knowledge in this way, which is what an aesthetic or descendental philosophy is really doing, crossing this threshold is no longer a matter of claiming to know something that we could never know. It's with certainty, but rather getting rid of the idea that we could ever know anything with certainty, and recognizing that metaphysics is speculative, but it can be experimental and pragmatic. And so if we refound philosophy on this basis, we can then re-engage with reality and not just be stuck in this Kantian enclosure. And so that's the plan of the book. That's what I try to achieve, and we'll see if anybody buys it.
Well, maybe we it's just been published and available, so I don't know if there's been much conversation yet, but that
pre-order, at least.
Pre-order. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see what the response is to that. So touching back on a couple of things you mentioned, so would it be fair to say that Kant's proposal of the subject with the faculties that produce the phenomenal experience into the noumena, is this a form of representationalism? Would that be fair to say, that this is the taking of information that is unverifiable in its origin, and we, through the sense organs, I know information people like to say that we filter out, or we can only process out of 10 million bits per second, we can only take in about 40 to 120, which is maybe perhaps another kind of, so along those lines, or is that not fair to Kant to say that is he attempting a realism by, so again, the noumena is so vague and so abstract that I'm trying to cipher out what we could, again, so, just for my naivety.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's this key distinction we could make between naive realism and critical idealism, and Kant's definitely a critical idealist.
Okay.
Now, naive realism, we say naive, but it's just common sense in many respects, that we think there's a world out there and we get to know it by observing it and thinking about it and so on, but there's really a world out there. And in some ways, I'm trying to return us to realism.
Yeah.
But not naive. I want a higher realism that's gone through the trial of the Kantian method, right? The critical idealist method, and come out the other side to return to reality. But is Kant a representationalist? I mean, he's talking about mental representations, but always as something constructed by the activity of the subject.
Okay.
So he would not say there's information coming in from the real world that we then are internally representing, because the subject, the mind, as it were, is, there's something stimulating our senses, but we don't know what that is.
Okay.
We've always already organized that stimulus in terms of our own categories, in terms of our own forms of intuition. And so it's not like an information transfer. All the information is already in the mind.
Okay.
And
So that's the a priori relationship that was
right.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, and there's like a school of thought nowadays that's very Kantian in this respect. In biology, there's the autopoietic paradigm, and in cognitive science, this gets translated into what's called inactivism and the inactive paradigm. And it's a refinement of Kant in many ways. It's more embodied, and it's dealing with complex systems science and all these things. So it's an advance on Kant, but it's basically still Kantian in the sense that an inactivist or an autopoietic biologist is always going to deny that an organism is simply an input-output machine of some kind, because the organism as an autopoietic or self-producing entity or a process is always bringing forth its own domain of significance, right? Which is to say, it doesn't make sense to refer to some kind of objective information out there in the world that would be received by this organism, because the organism's activity, its self-production, its autopoiesis creates a domain of significance whereby it's determining what is to count as information. There's no information ready-made out there waiting for the organism to go apprehend, right? From the inactive point of view, very Kantian perspective. And I like it so far as it goes, but it leaves us with critical idealism. And I want to restore a form of realism. And so that's why I'm turning to thinkers like Schelling and Whitehead, who I think are compatible with the inactive autopoietic approach, but they go further. Because in some ways, inactivism and autopoiesis, they're epistemological frameworks, and they tell us if we take the biological realm seriously, then what can we know?
Yeah.
And I'm saying, well, what about physics and chemistry? Presumably, inactivists are not denying that life emerged at some point out of physics and chemistry, and so what was going on before life? Whitehead, Schelling, they're both some version of panpsychists, and so there never was a time when there wasn't an interior dimension to nature, right? And so it's a more metaphysical position than inactivism, but I think this Whiteheadian or Schellingian metaphysics can supplement this more Kantian inactivist approach. That's how I look at it.
Okay. And then one other matter to touch on, and then I'd like to start moving into how you work with Schelling and Whitehead through the years to do what you were just describing. When we say descendental, we are not necessarily invoking a supervenience necessarily. It's more that it's relational, right? And then again, when we talk about Whitehead and Schelling and process, we can unpack that. But just so there's, I mean, I didn't get confused, but I just want to make sure that when we think of a descendental versus transcendental, when I'm sorry if I'm gesturing the wrong way, but I just want to make, I just thought I'd throw that out there for clarity, that this is it a supervening process? And if it's not, then we can go into what you're going to share with us about Schelling and Whitehead systems.
Yeah, so by descendental as opposed to transcendental, what I'm trying to suggest is that whereas in Kant, space and time are forms of our own intuition, sort of, it's a very anthropocentric view of space-time, right? That it's not it's not a realistic view of space and time. And I'm not suggesting with the descendental method that space and time are just givens that are out there that we as conscious human beings have to conform to. I'm saying, building on Whitehead's understanding of the physical universe as composed of actual occasions and of other organisms, that space and time in the Whiteheadian view become this sort of field of possibilities that have been achieved by these organismic agencies over the course of billions of years. And so space and time are brought forth by subjectivity, as Kant supposed, but not just human subjectivity. They've been brought forth by the subjectivity of electromagnetism, and all the other sort of physical processes that through their relationships establish fields of possibility. And so when we talk about space and time as human beings from a descendental point of view, what we're engaging in is this inheritance of the achievements of organisms that have come before us.
Mm-hmm.
We're feeling their feelings rather than simply projecting a form from our own mind, right? And so the descendental, the descent aspect of this is in a way dropping back into this cosmic memory
Mm-hmm.
of cosmogenesis and the process by which space and time were brought forth by countless creatures that are not human, right? And so it's in a way rerouting us in the actual universe rather than the transcendental perspective, which is kind of disconnecting us, uprooting us from this cosmic community.
Almost asymmetrical in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because the subject is cut off. I think if I'm reinterpreting this correctly, subject is cut off from the perished objects, to use Whitehead's language.
Exactly.
The eternal objects
Mm-hmm.
that can crest but it's sort of the Indra's net of connection.
Yeah, I mean, another way to clarify what Whitehead is doing is he's generalizing Kant. So Kant says the human subject brings forth the world.
Mm-hmm.
And Whitehead's saying subjectivity is far more pervasive in nature, and every subject from the particle level on up brings forth a world, and always in relationship to other subjects,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so how do we reimagine the structure of space and time, which are we can be quite mathematically precise about that structure. And so, Whitehead's not denying that, but he's saying that this structure is not fixed. It's evolutionarily emergent, and it's emergent from the relationships among subjects, most of which are not human. And so the descendental method, again, is an invitation to drop into our feelings of inheriting, all of these perished subjects that have brought forth the spatio-temporal form of the universe that we inhabit.
I don't know if this is a good time to insert or invoke what Sheldrake talks about in the morphic resonance, because he invokes this idea of the perished subjects of the past. So if there's people out there that like that kind of metaphysics, that can be part of the imagery that we're establishing here. So I think would it make sense to talk about Schelling first, since he was there. In fact, he was a contemporary for a brief time before Kant died, I think in 1805. Schelling was born in 1775. So he was a student at the time of Kant's passing, I believe. And so Schelling took, and what's interesting on a tangent, I'm very tangential, I see this work that you're bringing together in this book and what you're attempting to synthesize in this book as being processorial in its own right. And I'm invoking Whitehead's scheme and system. It's like we were just talking about, like, sort of the perished objects and the concrescence and prehensions. Like I kind of felt that during the book, like that, Schelling, and this is true for a lot of what we do intellectually as people, not me, but I mean people who do this kind of work, that is that process happening. And that's a tangent, but and you don't have to pick up on that, but I just want to say I appreciated that in reading the book, that I was feeling that same thing. But so should we start with Schelling and see how he handled this with Kant, and then we'll bring Whitehead into the picture?
Yeah, so Kant dies, I think, in 1804.
Something like that,
And by that point, Schelling had already been a professor for 5-6 years. He was a young professor.
A young professor, because I want to say he was born in 1775. Keep saying
that's right.
Yes. Okay.
So by his early 20s, he was already teaching at the University of Jena, and a deep reader of Kant, and also trying to push the boundaries. So Kant, some of his later work, like the third critique, the critique of judgment, was very influential on not only Schelling, but the other post-Kantian idealists like Fichte and Goethe, who wasn't really a philosopher, but was very interested in these questions. Goethe was the one that got Schelling his position at the University of Vienna.
Oh, okay.
I mean, in some ways, he hoped Schelling could explain Kant to him. But so Schelling reads this third critique, which the first part of it deals with beauty and art, and the second part deals with purpose or teleology in the organic world. And Kant makes this discovery or realization that while Newtonian mechanistic principles can, he thought, exhaustively explain the physical world, the inorganic world, the biological world displays a form of causality which is circular. He called it self-organization, a self-organizing form of causality. And so this is really the birth, you could say, of complex system science. And so the Newtonian approach to causality always has the cause, the effect external to the cause, right? It's more of a linear form of causality. Whereas organisms are they're self-causing. The cause and the effect are internal to one another, such that you have in an organism a collection of parts which produce one another for the sake of a whole. A collection of parts which produce, so they're recursively bound up, producing one another according to some plan. The whole, which seems to pre-exist the parts, right? And so Kant's like, this can't be explained mechanistically. He went so far as to say there could never be a Newton of the grass blade, of even a mere blade of grass, right? Even the simplest life form cannot be explained mechanistically. And later biologists, philosophers of biology and theoretical biologists would say, oh, well, whatever, 60 years later or so, here comes Darwin and he's the Newton of the grass blade, right? And that, I think, totally misunderstands both what Kant was arguing and what Darwin was offering with his theory of natural selection, which is a theory of speciation, not a theory of the self-organization of individual organisms. In other words, and I won't go too far into this, but Darwin is offering us a theory of phylogenesis, or how new species arise, not a theory of ontogeny or ontogenesis, which is how individual organisms arise and develop. Kant, you could say, was more focused on this issue of ontogeny. How is an individual able to produce itself as an organism? Darwin's whole theory of natural selection presupposes, without explaining, self-organizing organisms, self-producing organisms that can reproduce, right? And so there's two things that Darwin presupposes, not only reproduction, but self-production, in order for his theory of natural selection to brilliantly, explain, at least to provide one mechanism to explain speciation. So Darwin's not the Newton of the grass blade, at least as Kant had imagined it. And so to go back to Schelling, he reads this book and is really enthralled with what Kant is suggesting here. But he thinks that Kant doesn't go far enough, because Kant basically runs into this problem that, these mechanistic categories that determine the rest of the phenomenal world can't determine or explain organisms. And so Kant says, oh, and this means that we can't really ever have a science of biology. We can only ever have a kind of heuristic or regulative understanding of organisms. We can approach the living world as if it were mechanistic and see how much we can learn about how to predict what happens. But that's not real knowledge. That's just a sort of as if knowledge, because, he could see quite clearly that there's more than mechanism going on here. And so Schelling says, why can't we have a science of organism?
Mhm.
If we imagine the whole of nature as a self-organizing system, we can inaugurate a whole new kind of science. And Schelling's natural philosophy is, in a way, an inversion of Kant, right? How do you cross the Kantian threshold? Well, you turn Kant inside out.
Yeah.
And so what Schelling says is, rather than Kant's framework, where the question is basically, for Kant, what must the mind be like? How must the mind be organized such that nature could appear to us in the way that it does,
Mhm.
in this lawful way that science can understand? Schelling inverts this picture and says, well, what must nature be like such that mind could have emerged from it?
Mhm.
And nature, for mind to have emerged from it, must in some way be ensouled. It must be organic, and it must be a kind of dynamic evolutionary process that's constantly intensifying what originally was a less intense form of subjectivity. And so Schelling elaborates a quite beautiful philosophy of nature on this basis. It's evolutionary, not in the Darwinian sense, but in a more cosmic sense.
Mhm.
And Kant lived just long enough to read some of Schelling's work here,
Okay.
and was uneasy with it, but also inspired by it. And there's a posthumous work that's just published as the Opus Posthumum that Kant never was able to publish or really organize before he died. And the German idealist scholar Eckhart Borster publishes it and tries to introduce and explain it. And it's a series of drafts where Kant is attempting to arrive at what Schelling achieved in his own way. Kant was still worried about the transcendental limits of knowledge and thought that Schelling was being too metaphysical, and but nonetheless realizes that Schelling's right. This is the path forward.
Mhm.
And in my dissertation, I try to pick up on some of the arguments that Kant sketches, and this is where the ether comes into the
Mhm.
picture.
Okay.
In this late posthumous text, posthumously published text, Kant really speculates about an etheric medium by which the human mind could come to grasp the inner workings of nature, of the physical world, in an organic way, by analogy to our experience of our own bodies and our capacity for bodily motility. And
Mhm.
so he's imagining this etheric medium, as it were, that would connect our experience of our own inner lives to the inner life of the natural world, right? And that's a connection that I really try to amplify and expand upon in my dissertation through Schelling and through Whitehead, who also both had ether theories. And I bring in the esotericist Rudolf Steiner, who similarly described an etheric dimension of nature, which he related to the plant world. And so that's where the ether comes in here.
Mhm. And I think if I read you correctly, that the ether is still with us in our speculation and our philosophy of science. I mean, we maybe think about dark energy and dark matter. I think you referenced Einstein, and it's this thing. And when you were just speaking about Kant wrestling with this, it almost made me think, because I know some of the German, the Weimar intellectuals were influenced by Eastern thought. And I almost think like this ether kind of speaks to a chi, or whatever you want to call it. Maybe this is this intermediary system or process or whatever it is that, like you were saying, can reconcile this gulf that Schelling pointed out. Maybe I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know if Kant was influenced by Eastern thought, but it just smells of that kind of flavor a little bit.
not as much as the idealists who came after him.
Right, like Schopenhauer or somebody who kind of.
Yeah, right, sure, definitely Schopenhauer, but even the romantics in Jena, like Schlegel, who translated the Bhagavad Gita into German, maybe not for the first time, but one of the earliest translations that was being passed around among all these thinkers.
Okay.
And in Fichte, it's quite striking how similar his idealism is to a kind of Advaita Vedantist perspective. And so, yeah, there was definitely an influx of Indian philosophy.
Okay, but I shouldn't impose that on Kant. But I was just feeling that a little bit, like did
Yeah,
that seep in from somewhere? Because I mean, sort of Platonism is all over the place, and in that So I was just wondering if it snuck in somehow into the
yeah.
back of his mind. Maybe
Well, I mean,
anyway.
yeah, in so many ways, East met West, all the way back in ancient Greece.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
so we have, I think, sometimes a somewhat distorted picture that suggests that Asian philosophy and mysticism only came into the West in the 60s or something, which is
Right,
not,
like that
not
Europe was hermetically sealed for
right.
400. Yeah, my latest tangent I've been on is the Gymnosophist meeting Pyrrho of Elis
Mm,
and Alexander the Great and his conquests of
right,
northern
exactly.
Afghanistan. Yeah, so there was a lot of synthesis going on there, or at least a lot of exchange of ideas. So anyway, so back to Kant, back to his trying to respond to Schelling. Sorry, I am so tangential sometimes.
No, no worries. Yeah, yeah. So Schelling's natural philosophy was in dialogue with these new paradigm sciences at that time, in the early 1800s, late 1700s, where electricity and magnetism, chemistry, were all making these great advances. And Schelling immersed himself in this literature, and his early philosophical texts on this dynamic evolutionary process in nature, just drenched in citations to the most up-to-date science. And he had a tremendous influence on especially the biologists of the time. But then by the middle of the 19th century, a different philosophy had arisen, positivism, basically, a
Mm-hmm.
much more materialistic, mechanistic approach, really focused on quantifying nature and adverse to metaphysics of any
Mm-hmm.
kind. and
Yeah.
and Schelling's approach to the natural world as something organic and as something that we can know through a kind of participation was really lampooned as the worst kind of romantic wishful thinking. And it just got dismissed. And it's not really until Whitehead in the 20th century that someone of scientific, great scientific, capacities and training took another look at this. And the reason that Whitehead did take another look at this organic, romantic approach to understanding nature and to doing science was because of the collapse of Newtonian physics,
Mm-hmm.
with the rise of relativity and quantum theories in the early 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
Whitehead realized very quickly that the mechanistic philosophy of nature was dead in the water. It can't possibly be true if matter is really energy, and if the idea of simply located bits of matter is no longer an adequate description given what quantum theory was discovering.
Mm-hmm.
He realized that natural science needed a new metaphysics, and the organic picture of the universe seemed far more adequate than the mechanistic picture. And so Whitehead set to work trying to work out the details, with great logical rigor and scientific adequacy and applicability to the full range of human experience, right? But again, similarly to Schelling, Whitehead brings forth, he writes Process and Reality, brings forth this new cosmological vision in the mid 1920s, just as philosophy was having a second love affair with positivism,
Mm-hmm.
logical positivism. Like, Wittgenstein is at Cambridge. Bertrand Russell, Whitehead's former student and collaborator, is just in love with Wittgenstein's genius. Not Wittgenstein the person, he was kind of difficult to get along with, but
Oh, okay.
his mind is brilliant. And the logical positivists just say, we can't know anything beyond what our senses reveal to us. and what logical thought allows us to deduce based on what the senses reveal to us. And so all this metaphysics crap is useless. And so Whitehead was kind of untimely in articulating this new vision. He attempted to provide a new cosmological vision just in the wrong season, and it's taken another 100 years for people to take another look. And I think this time it's not a revolution in science that's leading people to take another look. It's several factors. The fact that there hasn't been a major scientific breakthrough in a century, the fact that there are still a dozen plus interpretations of quantum theory that no one can settle on. No one knows which one would be most adequate. But also the ecological crisis, which it touches everything. Obviously, it's raising major problems for the industrial mode of production in our political economy, but it's also a challenge to a certain kind of scientific knowledge that imagined that nature was just a machine. Because it turns out when you treat nature that way, the ecosystems of the planet begin to break down, because an ecosystem is a holistic process. It's not just a collection of separate, isolated parts that you can swap out. And, the idea that you could manufacture tens of thousands of new chemicals that have never existed before and set them loose across the planet without there being any consequences in a holistic system is, from a Whiteheadian point of view, totally batshit insane. And so I think the ecological crisis is leading people to look again at what were once dismissed as romantic, wouldn't it be nice if it were true, everything is connected sort of philosophies, because it turns out they're truer than the mechanistic ideas. So that's a quick run through of sort of the development of thought and the reception of Schelling and Whitehead over the last couple of centuries.
Fittingly, I think we were talking about plants earlier, and we can bring them back in again. I think plants are our companions, can teach us what this connectedness and this holistic perspective, they can offer that perspective to us. And again, I'm a kind of a plant freak. And when you bring the mycological kingdom in the relationship that mycology has with flora, plants, and how, there are parasitic plants out there. There are plants that are obnoxious and things like that, but in their system, they are not. So you speak to the ecological crisis. I'll put it through a sort of botanocentric perspective, that when we bring alien plants into, especially here in Florida, I can speak to this, or in California, you get that, where these things set up camp that don't belong here. And then it's like those 10,000 chemicals, all hell breaks loose, and we've got a disaster. Same thing with reptiles and all these other things that come in. But going back to plants and teaching us a lesson, I think when we see the deep time processes of what we could call evolution and adaptation, but more like, to speak in Whiteheadian terms, of satisfaction and creativity, and the lure, the eros, the draw, that these plants maybe are more aligned with that kind of, I don't want to call it thinking, but behaving, or whatever it is that they're doing, that they could show us that. And so, indigenous cultures could speak to us as intermediaries and thinking this way. And I love touching base with tribal cultures from time to time, whether it's just simple documentaries anywhere around the world, and their relationship with their environment. And how they are, as the Buddhists say, there's an interdependence, there's a connectedness that you cannot violate, because you could lose your family, your tribe, your family, whatever it is that you have there. So yeah, I think this may be an answer to what you were just saying, that we could start with being more humble and learning from things that we would otherwise just walk by and take for granted. There's my plant to activist speech there.
No, absolutely. I mean, we are we're made of mud, and
Mhm.
mud and soil are, products of plant life. And we do need a strong dose of humility, I think. And so that's part of the moral of the story of,
Yeah.
why returning to the vegetal, to the plant realm, is, I think, so important. And there's so many lessons we can learn from plants. Just the virtues of growing towards the light. I mean,
Mm.
it's very simple, but I think while animals like us are afforded much more freedom, because of our capacity for locomotion and um, our much more intense metabolisms and so on,
Mhm.
we lose the simplicity of what life is really all about. And so, in terms of restoring a sense of contemplative contentment with just the simplicity of being alive, I think if our civilization is to survive this evolutionary bottleneck, self-created evolutionary bottleneck, I think it's because we will have remembered the virtues of uh, plant life. I
Mhm.
mean, just even economically, I think of plants, the plant realm as kind of like the original gift economy.
Mhm.
Obviously, when plants produce fruits and nuts and different things that animals eat, there's something in it for them because their seed
Yeah.
gets spread.
Mhm.
But they sure do coat that seed in a yummy, delicious
Yeah,
carrying
it's a
package for us.
payoff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Mhm.
you used the word humility earlier, and when we're talking about plants, so the etymology of humility is grounding, and so
Exactly.
there we go. And so plants teach us that, and uh, they are helpless in the sense that they cannot be ambulatory, but nonetheless, they are also very wise in that they make the most of that by adapting to. There's a plant in South Africa that was a holdover from a warmer, wetter period, and it turned into, this Mozambique or wherever it was, just suddenly turned into desert. But this poor species, there's only a few left, but they've, as quickly as they could, tried to adapt to this new hardscrabble environment. It's an inspiring story if you're into plant mythos and things like that. And I'll send it to you. But I mean, and if I find a link to it, I'll send it to have it in the description field of this video. But it speaks to that kind of thing. And the other thing, before I lose my train of thought that I was going to share in that sense. And plants are also, I think they're called automorphs or yeah, I think automorphs, like they generate their own food, they generate their own energy. Whereas we, as you said, we have to, keep up with that second law of thermodynamics and feed ourselves, and they've got that covered. So yeah, again, there's so much philosophy in plants. Who was in chapter 4? Who was the philosopher that you referenced, so we can get his name out there? That
Michael Martyr.
Yeah,
Michael Martyr. Yeah.
I want to look into their work and understand more about their
Yeah.
approach, because again, not to belabor, Viva plants, but yeah, it's just a lot can be brought up.
Yeah, there's a new book coming out very soon on it's more focused on trees, in particular philosophy of trees, or arboreal philosophy.
Mm,
Um, and this great phrase is coined in this text by the editors, arboreality. So another
hmm.
way of getting it, like vegetal ontology or whatnot. Martyr will be in there. I have a chapter in there. Uh, Laura Pustarfi is one of the editors. Should be out later this year. So, but Martyr himself already has 2 or 3 books um, on the subject of what philosophers can learn from the plant world. I highly recommend them. It's very creative philosophizing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I plan to, because again, I've always felt like I've had a relationship with plants, but I've only recently gotten into philosophy in the last few years, and I've had to do a lot of just groundwork to try to understand the last, whatever, 2,500 years, or actually 3,000 years of philosophy. So
Yeah.
I'm working on it, but yeah, I could immediately latch on to that kind of thinking. What I'd like to do is, in your epilogue, you talk about the theistic aspect of Whitehead's work and theism, theology in general. And there were some things that really resonated with me. And forgive me if I don't portray this in the right way, and you can correct me, but you almost asked a question that I like to entertain, and that is that, when we invoke the term God, and Whitehead has a very interesting use for that term in his metaphysics and his scheme. But you seem to suggest, and again, correct me, that we can accept to ourselves that, and at one level there is, with Whitehead's work, we dismiss the idea of this bearded, anthropomorphic, angry, narcissistic skyfather of the Old Testament, and move on to the God of nature, the God of philosophy, maybe more in the realm of Spinoza's God, but also that, as you were saying earlier, this algebraic placeholder, that we can enter into this relationship with the value, with the signifier and the signified and the symbolism. And that's something, and I love apophasis. I love the idea of, like, I can never know. So if I were to invoke that term, I could never, how can I describe it to you? And I think if you hard press anybody, that would be a difficult task. So let's talk about that for a moment. And we can weave in Whitehead's use of the dipole God in his scheme. But that really touched my nerve in a good way, to see that you wrote about that. And again, straighten me out if I didn't represent that properly.
No, that's right. I mean, I think process theology is one of the aspects of Whitehead's thought that was picked up in the 20th century, many decades ago, like through the University of Chicago, Charles Hartshorne in particular, and others that, led into John Cobb Jr.'s work and David Ray Griffin's work, both process theologians. And it really branched into the many churches and had an effect on people's lives in a way that sometimes this really highfalutin abstract theory can seem divorced from. And I think what I've found with process theology is it allows people who are so turned off by the more patriarchal forms of religious belief and language to rediscover a relationship to maybe the religious tradition of their origin, as in their family origins, and to see it in a new light.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of my favorite process theologians, Catherine Keller, who I quote in the epilogue, has a way of reading the Bible and showing just how process relational it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even in the Old Testament, she has a whole book called Face of the Deep that's on the first two words of Genesis, showing how what in the Bible is referred to as the deep is that there's a whole theology of the deep, of the depths, that is more feminine, that is more embodied, that is more relational, and you can out of that sort of reinterpret the entirety of the biblical narrative, but also plenty of Muslims and Jews. There are a lot of process rabbis and Islamic theologians who have done something similar with their traditions. And so, but you don't need to be a theist either to be interested in Whitehead's philosophy. I think he himself says that there's a deeply Buddhist flavor to his worldview. But yeah, in this epilogue, I'm trying to revitalize religion in a way, and show how, look, science and religion do not need to be in a battle to the death. They are, in some ways, they need each other, and it's not quite as simple as science is about facts and religion is about values, but that gets at some aspect of it, because the problem with that way of construing it, if you take it too literally, is it neglects the extent to which science itself values truth, as does religion. But religion is also about facts often. The facts of the life of Jesus, for example, are very important in Christianity.
Yeah.
And so it's not so neat as that fact value distinction. Reminds me of something Galileo said centuries ago, that science tells you how the heavens go, religion tells you how to go to heaven. It's a nice little,
Yeah.
but I'm very, very interested in the science religion dialogue. And I wanted to end the book by at least gesturing towards a new way of being pious, of being religious, of engaging in ritual and liturgy, and taking seriously the role that particularly religious community can play in changing the world for the better. And I use the post-structuralist, or if you want, just postmodern philosopher Gilles Deleuze as a to sort of stir the pot. He's more of a definitely non-theistic, even atheistic thinker, who did draw some lessons from certain theological thinkers, but nonetheless is very much skeptical of any traditional forms of religion, right? And so, or the risks of being captured by dogmas and whatnot. And so I wanted to enter in a dialogue with him just to keep myself honest and aware of the challenges to being religious in the modern world and the postmodern world. We'll see. Hopefully I pulled it off in a way that would be inviting to people who are not initially inclined to take any form of theism or religion more broadly seriously.
Yeah. I think you did a really good job, because it really resonated with me, because I'm in that space right now where it's like, for me, it doesn't matter what's on the other side of the veil, or if there is something, again, even with Whitehead's ginger handling of what he called God, for me, it doesn't matter, because I kind of see this place, this planet that we occupy, as being where we are, what we're doing, and how things are unfolding. And if you trust perhaps in something that's either the pars pro toto, or even maybe behind the veil, or whatever, is that you just trust in what's going on and trust in what's in the process, without escapism, without fantasizing, without latching on to daddy roles or anything like that. You can just enter into this better flowing relationship. Go ahead if you were gonna.
Well, just another really crucial point here that I try to make in the epilogue is that we have the wrong idea of religion as merely a matter of belief. And this idea that I think is actually quite modern, that all you need to do is believe the right thing and you're good with God, or you'll go to heaven, or whatever. Rather than belief, I really try to say that, like, this whole question, do you believe in God, or does God exist or not, is beside the point. I want to see religion as less about what you believe than about who you are. It's a matter of the cultivation of character, and it's also a more pragmatic approach to religion. If you are going to engage in the belief in what have you, afterlife, or things like of this matter, the question you should focus on is, what are the consequences of that belief? How does it change your character? How does it change the way you relate to others? How does it change your decisions about what to commit yourself to while you're alive? So it's more of a pragmatist orientation toward religious belief, right? Focusing on the fruits of that belief.
Yeah. And I think I might have written it down. You had there's so many beautiful quotes in your book. But yeah, something I wrote down spoke to that, and I don't want to belabor and have dead air because I can't find it. But yeah, I agree. And so I've been consuming a lot of Dave Snowden lately, and Dave Snowden is, sort of hard-nosed complexity science kind of guy, and deals with, really heavy-duty stuff. But he'll say, I'm a cultural Catholic. And yes, I realize let's bracket all the nonsense, but I've, and a couple of times I was like, really? Yeah, that's an interesting tension you've developed there, because he'll call somebody like I won't name names, but he'll accuse people of pseudoscience and bullshit and things like that. And it's like, and then he says and so it took me a couple of goes to listen to him. I'm using him as an example, that he sees the value in the existing architecture and the scaffolding that has been developed over 1,500 years. And with a few tweaks and a few twists and dials, if we could just get that second Reformation going, or whatever it is we need to do, maybe it's not Catholicism, but if something can emerge that brings the significance of the meaning and the value and the ends that can arrive rather to develop that. So I don't know if it's a good amendment to what you just said, but I hold hope that that with good faith leadership and good faith investment, and I use faith in a couple of different ways, that people can turn religion around instead of making, especially here in the United States, some sort of outlet for nationalism or populism or whatever, that it can be more of a means of doing what Christ seems to have wanted to share with us. And that is, again, empathy, compassion, humility, community, all these things. So I see the potential there. And like I said, Snowden's a good example because he's just a really rigorous person, and he'll say, and he's also, he's a new materialist too, which I think is interesting. And it's laudable. And even in his systems dynamics, he's like, bring it down to the micro. Don't think macro, bring it to the micro. So new communities can arise. So anyway, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't know Snowden's work, but I do appreciate the recognition that, religious communities have an important role to play. And, I don't know if he goes in this direction, but, it strikes me that something about human nature compels us to express ourselves and orient ourselves to existence in a religious way. And if we don't have one of the traditional religions, or even if we think of ourselves as atheists and as irreligious, we're going to find a surrogate. We're going to have some alternative thing that we don't call religion, but that functions just like religion.
Oh, yeah.
And so the danger there is, if we have a pseudo religion that we don't think of as a religion, it often can do, I think, real harm to other domains of life. Like if we turn to politics and imagine that that our political engagement could be some kind of surrogate religion, then I think we end up in a situation where we push for utopian visions, which might sound great on paper, but that, in attempting to actualize that, you're in a way, Eric Voegelin, the philosopher, talked about immanentizing the eschaton, making something that only makes sense as a religious aspiration into a worldly aspiration. And it's not that we don't want to bring like love and charity and humility and all of these traditional religious virtues into our worldly everyday interactions with people. Of course. But to imagine that like the state could step in and enforce a utopian vision rather than having people of goodwill who have cultivated virtue to bring it forth from the ground up, right? From the local level, the grassroots level. I think, we run into this danger, I think, when we replace religion with something else. Some people replace religion not with politics, but with science. And then you have all this techno, you get transhumanism, right? This idea that if religious belief won't do it for us, then through technology we'll become immortal. I'd rather keep my religion religious and not mix it with science and politics and these other things, right? So
you could, in this line of thinking, religion is a tool. And I could take a hammer and build a house, or I can take a hammer and smash somebody's head in. And so what I do with that tool is very important. But that's how I look at religion as a neutral device, and all of the platitudes that come with it, and all the didactics, and the deep history and the connections of past brilliant thinkers. But that can be used to a good utility if it is employed again in good faith, or it is employed with the right intentions, perhaps, or whatever. But I totally agree with you. I call it like the will to spirit. like all the other wills that we have, power and meaning and all these other, and sex and all these other things, but will to spirit, which can convert into a will to religiosity. I think, as you said, it could be Hello Kitty, it could be Duran Duran, it could be, all these little pseudo religions spin up in our lives, because I've met people who are really obsessed with bands, and, they have the archetypal things like saviors and demons and all these, priests and so forth. And it's just part of our nature, it goes back, and we spent thousands of years in that environment. And it's just been, as you said it, there's been not just a Whiteheadian bifurcation of nature, but a bifurcation of sort of a more mimetic or psychosocial bifurcation during the Enlightenment project, where we had to divorce religion from reason. And that's, like guys like John Vervaeke are trying to sort all that out. And let's hope it lands on its feet like a cat or something. This free fall that we're in right now, trying to, because I don't think religion as it in the West, like say, let's just pick on Christianity for a moment. It just, people are falling away from that because it's not delivering, I think, what people are hungry for in this, again, spiritual hunger that may be going on. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think the idea of a God that would deliver us is dead. That God is dead. The process God is, as Whitehead says, the power of God is the worship that God inspires. And so we are the hands of the divine, and the work that we do in the world is the only way that the divine could deliver anything, right? We are the delivery men and women. And so it's more of an imminent sense of hearing the divine call to engage in a loving way in our activities as human beings.
And I think in your book, you even mentioned that in a processorial orientation, that the God we work with may arise and may perish with us in a system, whether to, again, try to invoke Whiteheadian terms, it perishes into the past, and a new, the linear one increased by one kind of thinking that, as you just said, maybe the transcendent Sky Father, which has been in our folklore forever, that we have to now, what should we say, concress or enter into a prehensional relationship with a new perspective of this force, or whatever you want to call it. In Whitehead terms, it was the mental pole and the physical pole, and sort of the means to the creative process, and the imagination.
I use the image of incarnation in this epilogue because that's the symbol that speaks to me, but the deed really, that if we want to remain in relationship to the divine at this point, we really need to take on board this idea that God became flesh and died. And there's so many different ways to interpret that that we don't have time to get into right now. But the idea of incarnation to me means that in effect, there's no outside supernatural power that's going to save us. The divine has entered into the world and become human, and now it's up to human beings to act divinely, to act in a way that is not limited to just the selfish little ego that wants to be gratified, but to act to serve this deeper evolutionary purpose that gave rise to us, and that if we respond appropriately will give rise to even greater glories in the future, and that will still be us in a way, because not just incarnation but reincarnation is part of what I see going on here. So
yeah, absolutely. And it's not escapism. It is a religare is a rebinding, or it is a reconnection to the good. Perhaps maybe we could just invoke a little Neoplatonism there to say that we are the nous that is or the noose is the intermediary, go back to the ether, right? The intermediary that helps bind us to the good.
This is one of the, I mean, people think panpsychism or this organic view of the world is all wishful thinking, and it would be nice if that were true, but you're really just trying to escape from the inevitability of death. But no, I think panpsychism, like the view that Shelley and Whitehead are putting forward, is suggesting that actually there's no escape. Even death is not an escape. In a process relational universe, experience is a continuum. It's always ongoing. And even if you wanted to escape, you can't. And I think in some ways, the effort to escape is hell. That's what hell is.
Yeah.
Because you're struggling against something, an inevitability of ongoingness. Right. And so showing up, being incarnated, recognizing that we're on a journey together and that we can either participate or we can resist. To me, that's what it means to be religious. Is that, I'm here to participate.
Yeah. And that's addressed, I believe, in other wisdom traditions and other, so it's something that is almost a universal in our psychosocial structures. So I agree. And at the worst, let's ramp that up a little bit and see what happens, because we've tried other things and we find ourselves where we are. So I know you're coming up on a time limit here. Can I ask you to share one last thing or anything else you want to bring forward relating to the book, or anything else before we wrap this one up?
Sure. Well, I mean, thank you so much for the great questions and dialogue. And, I would just say that I frame the book as an experiment. And whether or not it succeeds, I don't think it's an all or nothing thing. Maybe parts of it succeed and others don't. But I really do welcome responses, and maybe they're critical, but I really especially welcome constructive responses that say, hey, I don't know about this part, but hey, that part, we could really build on that, because this is a collective effort ultimately. And I'm not here trying to prove a point that I am dogmatically locked into. I'm here again experimenting, hoping for collaborators, but I really do want this work to be received and responded to in that light. So
okay, yeah, and you put something on the table, and so for somebody like myself, and again, I'm just general audience, not terribly versed in a lot of what's going on here, but it took me a few years, but I got Whitehead after a while, thanks to you, and I have Process and Reality, and so it's come together for me. And this is just a new dynamic. It's a new avenue of, and also a sort of genealogy of ideas that can help me to further understand and do my own Creole and do my own synthesis projects of what resonates with me. And I think you said something very important. Don't be dogmatic. I call it doxastic humility for myself. It's like, my beliefs are irrelevant. And so I was talking about the Pyrrhonians earlier, this is where I'm coming from. It's like, okay, just relax. But at your level, as a philosopher, as an academic and an intellectual, I hope there is a good, positive conversation. If there's pushback, let it be in good faith. Let it be for the intention as a dialectic to bring the matter forward. And so, yes, let's invite that. But for somebody like myself, who's just what do I call myself? I'm a hobbyist when it comes to ideas. I take other people's ideas and I try to understand them. That it's helped me, and it's given me some steering. So I appreciate that, Matt. And I know others will benefit in that regard too. And so to the YouTube audience, all relevant contact information, or I should say social media and information to get a hold of Matthew's work will be down below. Thank you, YouTube audience, so much for your time. I usually keep about 10% to the end. Guys like you, usually they'll get a little more retention because there's people that follow your work. So that hopefully, I'm sure you'll be up a little bit higher on that as far as like the whole program, the whole conversation. But Matthew, thank you for your time. Thank you for indulging someone like myself, again, who's not an academic or an intellectual. It's just somebody who's doing this kind of more of A, as a hobby, but also B, to be my level of sort of street level correspondence and sharing of ideas. Sometimes I talk to people and they're like, yeah, it's just like whatever. Yeah. But sometimes I land things with people and it's like so fun to see people open up who don't put much thought into, this kind of talk, this kind of ideas. So
Yeah.
we all do our part.
I'm so grateful to you for reading it, and you ask great questions, and yeah, I hope your audience was able to follow along and appreciates it.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, for those of you who are here who are curious, Matthew has a wonderful YouTube channel. And if you go back earlier in some of the videos that were uploaded a couple of years ago, there's lots of heuristics. There's a lot of explanation that made it easier. I picked up process and philosophy a few years ago. I got about a third of the way through and I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? So I was like, so excuse my language, but I was just like, so that's how I found you about 4 or 5 years ago. And I started just listening to what you were saying and then doing that as a companion to the book. So it's doable. It's doable if you have the patience. And once you get it, once the light bulbs start going off, then Whitehead's work for me, I mean, I'm not dogmatically wed to it, but it's a beautiful system. I mean, it's something a mathematician would come up with. And so it's helped me, again, in a way of synthesizing my own stuff other things that I like to work with. It's been a brilliant means of sense making. And so again, Matthew, thank you so much for being part of that, me being able to decoding it for me, because it is abstruse.
Yeah. Well, my pleasure, Justin. Really great to be in dialogue with you again.
Yes, absolutely. And I would love to have you back. And so perhaps we can plan something down the road. But thank you for your time today. Thank you for your insights and your wisdom and the work you do. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right, Matt, I'll say goodbye to you after we're done when I hit the stop on the record. And to the YouTube audience, thank you guys so much, and take care of yourselves.